Today we're going to be talking about executive functioning. And executive functioning is a vast topic, so our goal for the next half hour is to provide a brief introduction into this topic. So today we'll include a brief overview of what executive functioning, or EF, is, how it is assessed, and how to intervene. If time allows for it, we're going to have a Q&A period, but if we run out of time, please submit your questions into the question box, and then what we'll do is we'll answer those questions, and when we post this webinar to our website, we'll have not only the webinar, but also the answers to the questions that were posed. Okay, so let's begin. What is executive functioning? Here's one definition. I find it to be a little bit technical unless you work along a lot of executive functioning kinds of things. So I do prefer some other kinds of definitions. Brain-based functions that involve mental control and self-regulation in order to achieve a goal. Or basically, this is the one that I really like most. It's even more simplified, but they're mental skills that help us regulate our behavior. And this is the definition I use when talking with individuals who may not be familiar with executive functioning, such as parents. Another way I go about explaining EF is to use metaphors. Take, for example, the metaphor of a CEO. A CEO is responsible for running a company and making sure each division within that company is on task, meeting deadlines, producing goods, conducting quality assurance, etc. All of this while they're trying to achieve the company's goal. We also have the symphony conductor. This is an individual who orchestrates all different sections of instruments in order to achieve the goal of producing really well-sounding music. They make sure that everyone starts at the right time, the different sections are cued and contribute at the precise moment intended, as well as having certain sections become really loud or really soft on command. I'm not going to go into these others, the pilot and the captain and the chef, but you can see they're hold on one second. Apparently I didn't share my screen. Hold on, we're having a technical difficulty. Well, it would definitely help if you guys could all see my screen, so that's what I'm waiting to see what I can do here. All right. We're going to see if we can pull it up somewhere else. All right, hopefully that worked. So this is the slide that we're on. Hopefully no one's too far behind. So the metaphor is a symphony conductor. I'm not going to go into those others, but as you can see, they're all people that coordinate or multitask in order to achieve a goal. So essentially, executive functioning skills are the skills that we possess to orchestrate our behavior in order to achieve a goal. And speaking of goals, goals are not necessarily long-term. Goals can be as short and as simple as being able to tie one shoe. Therefore, it's important to remember that executive skills play a role in academic, social, and emotional behavior in students. So there are a couple of different models out there regarding executive functioning, and this is one that I see a lot and one that I subscribe to. There's definitely other models out there that basically cover the same cognitive skills, but just call them the individual skills different names. The first set of skills helps us think of and select goals to help us solve problems. And these are, as you can see, planning and organization, time management, working memory, and metacognition. Planning is essentially how am I going to get to and complete my goal. Organization is designing and maintaining systems to achieve our goal. Time management, how much time do I have? How long will it take? How much do I devote to each task to accomplish my goal? And can I make my deadline? And then working memory. And working memory is huge. That's your ability to take information in, store it in your brain, decide if you're going to use it, and then use it if you want to. And working memory is probably one of the most important areas related to executive functioning because it's found in all aspects of learning. But it's not enough just to talk about these different areas. We also need to talk about what these deficits might, or what deficits in these areas might look like. Planning, organization, and time management deficits you can easily observe. But possible deficits in the area of working memory look like forgetfulness, making careless errors, poor comprehension, poor mental computation, especially in the areas of math. We also have metacognition, and sometimes that's referred to as self-monitoring. And that's essentially, how is my behavior affecting others? How am I doing on this task? How did I do on the task? Should I do something differently next time? Deficits in this area might look like poor quality of work, poor pacing, looking egocentric or socially clueless, over or underestimating your abilities, poor motivation, poor self-activation, disorganization, and perhaps even some incompleteness of work. So then we have skills to help guide our behavior toward a goal. And these include the ones that you can see on your screen. Response inhibition, that's blocking out responses and distractions. Now, deficits in this area can be both behavioral and cognitive. If it's behavioral, that's where we see impulsivity or students that can't stop when asked to. If it's a cognitive inhibition, those are the students that we see that look off topic or they're daydreaming out the window. This is exactly what we see in ADHD. With ADHD, there's a mostly inattentive type and mostly hyperactive type or a combined type. The inattentive type would relate to the cognitive inhibition, where the impulsive type would relate more to the behavioral inhibition. Emotional control, that's essentially emotional regulation or dysregulation. And severe emotional dysregulation is a big component of the educational diagnosis of emotional disturbance. Students with weaknesses in this area may seem over-emotional or oversensitive, perhaps immature, moody, easily frustrated, unenthusiastic. We also have sustained attention, and that's your ability to block out any distraction and just keep the brain focused on what is the most important information to use at this time. Flexibility or cognitive flexibility or shift. What we see there is students who might shift too quickly, they look distractible or they don't finish things. If they shift too slowly, they might be looking like they're off daydreaming, or they're making off-topic comments. They're not necessarily paying attention to what's going on right in the moment. They could also look like they have rigid cognitive abilities or perseverations, and we see those in our students with autism at times. Many of these different skills that I just talked about interplay and overlap one of each other, so that's just something to keep in mind. Real quickly, the development of executive skills. They occur from birth all the way into early adulthood, and then we continue to hone and refine these skills as we age. The majority of executive functioning skills are located in the front part of the brain, and the front part of the brain is usually the last part of the brain to fully develop. So it's possible that skills aren't fully developed until someone's in their early 20s. But with that said, students should be developing age-appropriate executive functioning skills as they go through developmental stages. The way that executive functioning skills are developed is by what we learn from our external world and then how we internalize it, usually through incidental learning, direct instruction, and scaffolding upon previously learned skills. Therefore, language plays an extremely important role in executive skills. It allows us to attach language to skills, parts of skills, and internalize them, which allows us to go ahead and develop them so they can be used more automatically. So while these are usually standard features, executive skills are standard features in typically developing children, development depends on genetic and environmental factors, and most of the students that we work with fall into three different categories. The first category would be in the absence of a recognized disorder. The second would be a recognized condition or disorder such as ADHD or autism or traumatic brain injury. And then the last one is complex cases. And we're not going to go into these here, but I've included some information on this in Appendix A. No matter what the case is, it's important to approach any of the students who may be demonstrating some of these weaknesses with understanding and compassion. Often students with executive function skill deficits are viewed as being the same as other students and that they're just not applying themselves. Sometimes we see them as the lazy kid. I'm sure we've all heard of these types of students when working with staff who have a difficult time with these students. And we can often be skeptical or confused because the students with executive skills can look just like typically developing students with good executive skills who just choose not to perform. So it's vital to always ask this question. Is this a skill deficit or a performance deficit? Meaning, does the student actually possess the skill at all, or do they possess it and they're just not using it? And before we discuss how we go about determining that, let's look at some executive functioning deficits in action. All right, look familiar. So would we say that this is a skill weakness or this student has yet to learn what would keep him from doing this? Possible skill deficits in this area could be poor planning, poor metacognition, poor response inhibition. And as a parent of a child, what would we do if we saw this situation? We would yell at him to stop, but why? Because as adults, we have better developed executive function skills and know what will happen when he carries this out. This is why we need to step in and protect him. Here's another one. There's definitely some poor planning, organization, poor metacognition. As you're painting, do you see that you're painting yourself into a corner? Perhaps some poor response inhibition. Here's a room that many of us have seen. Is this a weakness, or do they still not learn the skill of organization? We would say that there's definitely poor organization, perhaps poor time management, poor metacognition, and we would say poor task initiation and goal-directed persistence if this person was told to clean up the room. If we said, go ahead and clean up the room, and this is what we return to, we could say that there might be some deficits in that area. And this one's easy. Metacognition for not checking over their work, flexibility for perhaps shifting too quickly to the next task, meaning they didn't finish what they started, and possible planning deficits if they didn't have enough paint to finish what they had started. And this is my personal favorite. Are they skill deficits or performance deficits? Executive functioning areas related to this particular scenario could be poor planning, poor metacognition, response inhibition, etc. But we could also look at the positives in this situation. Possibly good time management if they were trying to pull this off before an adult comes home and stops them. The guy riding the bike might have good sustained attention because he actually hit the ramp as opposed to going around it. Good goal-directed persistence. But again, very, very, very poor planning because the situation is not going to end up well. And there's probably a lot to be learned through the incidental learning here. But an important picture nonetheless, these are young children engaged in behavior that doesn't look like it's going to end up well. That's why as adults, we often lend our executive skills to younger students with less well-developed skills in an effort to stop them from hurting themselves, making poor decisions, regulate their behavior and their emotions. Okay, so assessment, the quick version. So how do we know if it's a skill deficit or a performance deficit? And we do that through assessment. Assessment of executive functioning skills are designed to elicit the presence or the absence of executive skills in everyday activities. Therefore, we look at specific behavior that shows strengths and weaknesses of executive skills, just like we did on the last slide. Different circumstances, persons, places, times when the behavior is more most likely or least likely to occur. We also want to look at what interventions have we done previously and what degree of success have they had. And then we also want to, and this comes along more so with intervention, is what is the likelihood that people will be on board with adjusting things to fit the child instead of expecting the child to fit the people in the environment. We also want to take a look at what's going on in the classroom. We're looking at antecedents, behaviors, consequences. And just a quick note about consequences. They can be good or bad, but mainly it's just a response to a certain behavior that they did. It gives us insight into their error monitoring, their planning ability, their organization, and could help us develop other interventions. It also relates really, really well to student motivation, which is a key component for students to learn these new skills if they have deficits. So looking at the components of EF assessment, here we go. We have detailed case histories, classroom observations, work samples, standardized rating scales, and individually administered assessments. When we look to assess executive functioning, we want to incorporate the 4 pillars of assessment: interviews, observations, informal and formal measures. Listed here are some of the things that we look at. And then the last section here, the standardized rating scales and individually administered assessments are good, but standardized assessments of EF skills are not without their problems. Formalized assessments require us to tell the student when to start something and when to stop, so we can't look at their task initiation abilities. And they usually don't allow for open-ended problem solving, so we can't see the creativity. And if a student scores really well on a formal EF measure, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can apply those skills in the real world. None of these assessments that we would administer, the formalized ones, come remotely close to the tasks that are required by students in the real world on a daily basis, but they're the best that we have. I've included some assessments for consideration if you were designing an executive functioning evaluation in Appendix B, but by no means is that list exhaustive. So once we have our assessment completed, we can go on to planning our intervention. We want to collect all the assessment data, hopefully from our 4 pillars of assessment that we just talked about. We want to connect behavioral challenges with the most appropriate executive skill domain. Granted, there's going to be some overlap and interplay, but we want to do our best to see which area has the greatest deficit. We want to look at 1 or 2 behaviors that if we increased them or decreased them would improve student performance. And we also want to keep in mind what will keep them using the skill and practicing the skill. It's not going to be a one and done. They're not going to learn it and then be able to apply it everywhere. It's going to require a lot of repetition and practice. And then we want to evaluate. How did we do? Did we implement our teaching strategy with fidelity? That is key, fidelity in doing this. If not, we can't blame it on the intervention or on the child not learning. We have to blame it on ourselves for not intervening the way that the intervention was designed. So getting to intervention, we're looking at promoting underdeveloped skills. And remember that executive skills are learned externally first and then internalized. So we must present this material externally very gradually and potentially over a long period of time, depending on the level of deficit the student is exhibiting. And then we can fade instruction and supervision and cues. We do this by intervening at the level of the environment first and then at the level of the individual student. At the environmental level, what we're looking to do is we change the physical or social environment. We use modifications to do this. We can move distracted children away from other distractions. We can clear or clean their desks of everything except for what they absolutely need in the moment to complete the task we're asking of them. We can provide them with folders and organized materials. If there's 8,000 posters hanging up in the classroom, maybe we reduce that to 1,000 posters so the kid doesn't stare at the posters all day. But on the other hand, depending on the deficit, if the kid isn't distracted or just needs some things to go along with working memory, maybe we post some multiplication charts or the like as a resource for the student to access. We can move students closer or further away from peers, essentially manipulating the environment in order to promote student success. Of course, the modification definitely depends on the skill deficit area that you're targeting. So changing the nature of tasks. And a lot of teachers, we know you guys already do this stuff, but we may have to break it down a little bit more when we're trying to do an intervention. We make tasks shorter by reducing the amount of work required, chunking information, reducing the amount of time spent on the work. We make steps more explicit. We provide cheat sheets, rubrics, step-by-step instructions on how to complete assignments. Using close-ended tasks such as fill in the blank, true, false, word banks. Having students do spelling words with magnetic letters. All of those assist with poor working memory abilities by allowing the student to recognize information and recall it rather than just relying on recall of information alone. Building in variety and choice by letting the child pick the order they do the tasks. Have them suggest ways that they would make the task more interesting to them. Building in variety and choice, there's a likelihood that we're also increasing their motivation and effort to complete the task. And as long as we're getting them to complete something that we want, the choice is not an issue. Providing them with 3 different choices, and it's all something that we want them to complete, then that should not be an issue, and it's definitely something that will increase motivation. We also want to change the way that we cue students. This is very important because we want to be careful about how much we are lending our own executive skills to the students, to what they're doing. Are we making the student dependent on adults to prompt them or assist them through every little task asked of them? And we see this a lot with special education students. If we lend our adult-developed executive skills, if you will, too much to the students, they're much less likely to further develop these skills that are necessary to meet the demands placed on them every day. Students with weak working memory abilities need frequent reminders. Verbal prompts and reminders aren't just, get ready for math. It might be, it's time for math. You will need your math book, a pencil, and some white-lined paper. Something like that. It has to be more explicit. We want students to become familiar with, create, and independently use schedules, lists, and visual cues. These are much more real-world functional skills that they can use at school, at home, and in the community, where they might not be able to rely on an adult to prompt them or cue them for every little behavior. For students with poor self-monitoring, we often use audio-taped cues or pager systems that buzz to remind them that they're supposed to be doing something. We use those especially for students that are off task a lot. It buzzes every 3 minutes, and then they can determine whether they are on task or not. And as we do this, we need to provide a lot of repetition and practice and fading of cues. And then eventually, these things that are external, these skills that they're learning externally will become internalized, and the students will be able to use them without the adult prompting. Changing the way that we interact with students, with modeling. As you sit down to solve a problem with a student, talk out loud the steps of how you are going about doing that. It's often helpful to use a I do, you watch, I do, you help, you do, I help, and you do, I watch approach to teaching skills. Once again, providing the opportunity for lots of practice along with that. But they need to practice all aspects of the skill. You don't necessarily want them just doing it in isolation. And when intervening, it's best to work on the primary skill deficit area as well as the overlapping or interplaying skills that you also deem as weak. And of course, appropriate positive reinforcement will encourage students to keep practicing and further developing their executive skills. So intervening at the level of the person. This question up here, when do prompts and reminders from adults become too much or impede student learning? That is such an important question to ask. If a student has a one-to-one or receives substantial adult support at school, I often ask the para or the adult that the student, I ask them, what is the student truly capable of doing without the assistance of an adult? And I'm kind of shocked because a lot of times I hear, I don't know, or the person doesn't necessarily, they can't give you a large explanation of all the different abilities and skill sets that the kid has. If they can't answer that question quickly, that's a big red flag, and we need to start leaning towards an appropriate comprehensive evaluation of the student's EF skills. And then here's our goal for intervening at the level of the person. We want to increase the child's capacity for using their own skills. Okay, in teaching skills, without getting into really specific interventions regarding EF skills that may be weak and impacting reading, writing, math, social interactions, or behavioral regulation, here are some guidelines for teaching certain skills. Make the task less complex. Build skills, practice them till fluidity, and then add complexity. So in teaching a specific skill, you want a plan, an organizational scheme, and a specific set of directions for the student to follow. We need to monitor their performance, provide encouragement and motivation and feedback, because these are going to be difficult things we're asking them to do. We want to problem solve with the student, even providing close-ended options like we discussed. And when providing reinforcement, for students that have skill deficits or haven't learned a skill yet, we need to provide a lot of reinforcement. Once they have learned the skill and they're demonstrating it a little bit more, we can go to an intermittent reinforcement schedule. But in the beginning, we want to reinforce every occurrence of it. One way of doing having students learn some skills is through using scripts. Using scripts is an excellent method for increasing the skill of metacognition, or thinking about your thinking. Again, this often requires an adult to work with the student until the student can learn and internalize the script. We want to write these steps and problem solve with the student as you go and model your own thinking process. Remember, we've got to start really easy or something that the student's going to have a lot of success with, and then we can add complexity as the student is able to internalize and start using these scripts. Okay, effort and motivation. There's essentially two types of tasks, ones that we're not very good at and ones we are capable of doing and we just don't want to do them. For the ones that we're not very good at, break down that task into much smaller steps to give them a taste of success. Don't move on to the next step until you've mastered the first. And this task might have to be very, very, very simple to begin with. And two, if a student is capable of doing a task and just doesn't want to do it, i.e. the lazy kid, we need to make sure that the student actually possesses the skill necessary to complete what we're asking of them, which at times can be easier said than done. We don't need to complete a formal assessment, but we do need to look at all the information that we already know or have about the student and determine whether it's a skill deficit or a performance deficit. Most children, especially older students, would rather look defiant than not knowing what to do or how to complete a task. It's with those students that we need to assess and intervene right away and teach them the appropriate skills that are more functional to achieve a goal, as opposed to the maladaptive behaviors that they engage in to achieve their goal. If we determine that the student possesses the skill and just isn't using them, we'd resort to other means of motivating the student to use the skill. So learning executive skills can be difficult. Essentially, we're retraining the brain by developing new pathways for the student so they can use the skill. It's very important to provide motivation along the way. And two ways of doing this is through just praising the student, and for more difficult cases, using behavioral contracts. Contracts, what we do when we develop a contract is to identify target behaviors, set a goal, decide on some rewards and contingencies, and write out an actual contract, and then we evaluate the process as we go. Behavioral contracts can be used for both individuals and entire classrooms if you see that there's a common deficit amongst the students. And then we have specific teaching routines. When teaching these routines to younger children, you want to keep them short and reduce the amount of steps. For older children, the directions can become a little bit more complex. Once again, this is all going to depend on your assessment of the student's level of executive skill deficit. Performing task analyses on these specific routines and conducting chaining and shaping techniques will allow for quicker acquisition of the skill, as well as retention and maintenance. A good resource to access to assist with task analyses, if you're not familiar with them, are occupational therapists. I go to our occupational therapists all the time to assist in this area. It's also important to note that once a student is taught a particular skill or routine, it may not generalize to other settings. Therefore, it is often necessary to teach these skills across multiple settings. That's an important part to remember. So those are the basic concepts of executive function assessment, and intervention. As I had previously mentioned, there are more specific interventions with regard to academic, reading, writing, math skills, and behavioral skills, but those are just beyond the scope of our presentation for today. So in sum, executive functioning is an umbrella term for cognitive skills that help us regulate our behavior in order to achieve our goals. These skills don't fully develop until we're in our early 20s, and that's why it's important for us to lend our executive skills to younger children. If students are requiring a great deal of adult assistance, it's important to determine if that's a skill deficit versus a performance deficit, and the student may need to be evaluated in order to determine that. After looking at your assessment data, intervene at the level of the environment first. Sometimes that's all that it will take. And then you can intervene at the level of the person if you need to. Be sure to make tasks less complex to build automaticity and then add complexity. Be sure to have a plan. Implement that plan, adjust it as necessary, and don't give up. Care and compassion are key to working with the children with executive functioning deficits, and it's important for them to see our goal-directed persistence so they can, as we model for them what it's like to follow through to achieving our goal. And remember, the ultimate goal is to increase skill automaticity and the overall student independence. Here are some references that were used for this presentation today. And as like I said, this will all be posted online. So that concludes our presentation for today. I want to thank you all for joining us for our Lunch and Learn webinar series on executive functioning. And I hope that we were able to increase your understanding of executive skills from this brief presentation. All the questions that were submitted will be answered and posted on the webinar, with this webinar on our website. And if you didn't get to ask a question or think of one later, feel free to email me at the address on the screen. Thanks again for your participation, and have a great day.